welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital mediator Warren Frey. On this episode, we have our monthly economics discussion with ConstructConnect Chief Economist Alex Carrick and Senior Economist Michael Guckes to discuss interest rates and their effects on the construction economy, along with the conditions we'll need to meet to move forwards to an economy based on renewable energy. But first, here's the latest headlines. The RCMP has started looking into a potential investigation related to the Progressive Conservative Government of Ontario's removal of some areas of protected Greenbelt lands for housing development. The Ontario Provincial Police said in a statement on August 23rd it had received a number of inquiries regarding a Greenbelt investigation. The Provincial Police Force said it referred the matter to the RCMP to avoid what it called, quote, any potential perceived conflict of interest, end quote. This comes a day after Ryan Amato, the Chief of Staff to Municipal Affairs and Housing Minister Steve Clark, abruptly resigned. And here's another controversial project with connections to Doug Ford's Ontario Tories. Therm Canada has released an updated design for the West Island of Ontario Place, which includes 4 more acres of public parkland and natural spaces alongside the water park and other attractions that are planned. The update features new areas designed in collaboration with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, but opposition groups have been vocal about the design of Therm's project, stating Ontario Place should stay in the public realm and a spa just doesn't fit the bill. From the west, the Kelowna Chamber of Commerce is urging BC Transportation and Infrastructure Minister Rob Fleming to consider building a second bridge over Okanagan Lake because of anticipated population growth in the region. The organization states in a public letter sent to the minister that Kelowna is one of the fastest growing census metropolitan areas in the country, but aside from highway maintenance, it appears the region is all but being ignored when it comes to major provincial investment in transportation infrastructure. And as fires ravage West Kelowna, the biggest infrastructure project in the city's history has escaped the flames. The Rose Valley Water Treatment Plant's budget is $75 million, and West Kelowna Fire Rescue Chief Jason Brolin stated in an August 18 press conference that while other structures were lost in the early morning, significant infrastructure was spared. Quote, the firefighters battled hard to protect critical infrastructure in the Rose Valley neighborhood. That includes the fire hall, the school, the chlorinator, the dam, and most significantly, the brand new Rose Valley Water Treatment Plant, a $75 million asset that is about to be turned on in our community. I'm happy to report all these structures are still standing. They're not damaged, end quote. And of course, we will have ongoing coverage of the BC wildfires and their effects on local construction in the southern interior, as well as Yellowknife. The situation remains fluid, so keep checking the Journal of Commerce for updates as crews battle the blazes. And that's it for the headlines. But up next, here's Alex, Michael, and myself looking at interest rates and construction. I usually start these discussions with I'm the dumbest guy in the room, and I'm really the dumbest guy in the room on this one because we're going to talk about interest rates and how that affects construction, and then sort of how that affects the conversion to a low to no carbon economy. So to start with, whichever one of you guys wants to go first, how do the rising interest? Oh, actually, let me put it this way: governments keep bringing interest rates up. How good or bad an idea is this, or was it a good idea and now it's a bad one? Or you guys explain it. Like I said, I don't know anything about this.
Yeah, well, I'm going to let Michael, you because you've guys given a lot of thought to this about how it affects individual contractors and so on. So I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say. Then I have some other thoughts, but anyway, there we go.
Well, so about a week ago, we put out, on our website, we put out some pieces regarding the Fitch rating decline. So Fitch Ratings, one of 4 major credit rating agencies here in the U.S. and worldwide, they knocked down the U.S. government's credit rating from AAA, which is pristine. You can't get better than that, to AA, I think AA plus. It's just, I think it was 1 down. And, in the short term, it's not hugely significant going from AAA to AA plus. It's only a very small change in like the perceived interest rate that you're going to pay for that knock in your credit rating. The point that I made in the article last week is that the U.S. government at least has taken on so much debt since 2007, which of course was the Great Recession, when we took on a huge amount of debt to sort of save the economy. During the time afterwards, we continued to rack up public debt deficits. He never worked it down at all. And then, of course, 2020 hits, at another, $7-8 trillion. It just depends on how you want to count that money. But right now we're at about 118% of debt to GDP, right? And a lot of people will say, well, gosh, if we imagine the U.S. government as a family, right, and say the family makes $100,000 just for nice round numbers, and the debt is $18,000, well, I carry a mortgage, that is many of us, right, might carry a mortgage that is bigger than that amount, for example. And so you would say, oh, well, that's manageable, 30 years, $118,000 mortgage, so on and so forth. But the point I made in that is that, the government doesn't get to play with 100% of GDP. It doesn't get to decide where all of those, $30 trillion go. When you look at tax revenues, right, I think it's right around, 16 or so percent, 15% of GDP is pulled aside as government tax receipts. And you're thinking, okay, well, now we've got, the example would change, right? It's like a family making $15,000 with a $118,000 mortgage. Well, that gets pretty bad. It's even worse because you have to remember that the government has all of this mandatory spending. And so when you think about how much mandatory spending the government has to spend on things like Social Security and food stamps and other, child welfare credits and things of that nature, there's only a very thin slice of money left. And that's what is called discretionary spending, right? And think about that little slice that is left having to support this incredible amount of deficit. Again, 30 something trillion dollars. What happens is that you effectively lose control of your own finances at that point, because small changes in interest rates, small changes in credit markets, anything can happen. And all of a sudden, that little tiny cushion that we have left goes away, right? And if that completely goes away, you would be in real trouble, right? Because you literally can do nothing more than you literally would have to take on more debt in order to pay off just the interest on the old debt, right? It rolls out of control. And we are so close to that unless, the government does basically two things, and they would have to be to significant degrees. And that is, of course, raise taxes and cut spending. The raising taxes part is politically difficult, as anyone in this country can tell you for decades now, right? Raising taxes is political suicide. So the other option is essentially to cut spending. Well, let's go back to that real thin slice of that discretionary spending I was telling you about. There are some major programs that fall under that discretionary spending, right? And they are things like public infrastructure and transportation. Defense spending is another big one, and education, right? So now we have this shrinking slice of the pie. It's being sucked up more and more by interest rates as well, by the cost of just managing the current debt load, things like that. But now you've got to say, look, to build this public project, we're going to directly take away much needed funding from education or much needed funding from defense. And so these three areas are literally fighting tooth and nail for this ever shrinking pool of money. And that is that was the main point of my article from last week was, look, we got to realize that's a really tough case for us to make, to say that, we need public infrastructure more than we need defense spending or more than we need education spending. So it is going to be a serious uphill battle for our industry. And that's it. That was the crux of that message. And I would encourage everyone, to go out to our economic news website. If you want to see the numbers, I have those all out there in that article for those who are interested.
Now, Alex, obviously our economy isn't anywhere near as big. Well, nobody's is really, except maybe China, to America. But it seems to me that we are, like I've always, and this is just a layman's observation here, but I've always found that the Fed seems a little more hesitant to raise interest rates than we are, the Bank of Canada is. So maybe you could say, A, if I'm even right about that, and B, how that affects us as a smaller economy.
The whole thing about raising interest rates, I'm not at all sure that we haven't gone too far as it is, because you look around and just see what's going on. There's, Hawaii's caught fire. California's got a hurricane. There's wildfires in the Yukon, Northwest Territories. There are disasters that are seen to be occurring all the time now, and they're getting people's attention, and so, and it's tied to certainly it seems to be tied to the idea of climate change. So there's a matter of, I think there's an interesting question here as to priorities, and it's a matter of which is the higher priority, to beat back inflation with the higher interest rates, or to try to facilitate the energy transition that everybody's talking about. And that energy transition is away from fossil fuels, which we've been dependent on for 300 years, towards alternative sources, which are electricity and so on. So it's energy transition versus beating inflation. And the thing is, this is difficult because government is continuing to use old policies, whereas maybe what's needed is entirely new thinking and different thinking, because certainly higher interest rates, yeah, they've brought inflation in both Canada and the United States down to less than half of what inflation was. But high interest rates do not promote the capital spending that's going to be needed over the years ahead. And there's other problems too. And I don't know how government is going to cope with all of this. You see, the traditional response of raising interest rates, we're at the point now where really what the Fed's goal is, and this is exactly the opposite of what its stated goal is or what its defined goal is, but it's by keeping interest rates high, it's trying to lift the unemployment rate. Because if you've got higher unemployment, then you've got some brakes being applied to wage increases. And it takes care of the labor shortage because you free up labor. But the problem is that labor isn't interchangeable anymore. Workers in one area of the economy who are released from their jobs may not in any way be capable of doing the kinds of jobs that are going to be needed moving forward. And then there's all kinds of other problems too. Like what if people just don't buy electric cars? So there's caveats. It's in other areas as well. But what if there really isn't? If you really can't stimulate the demand, would you have to keep supplying more and more subsidies? By mandating these carbon reduction targets, everybody should be aware that there very well may be a company or two, a very major company or two that goes out of business by doing this. So there's a lot of areas where traditional economic answers may not apply now. So I'm going to leave it at that for the moment, but there's other things. There's other things to be talked about as well.
Well, Michael, that makes me think this is what's happening in real time in the States. They're actually massively funding decarbonization in some ways with the Infrastructure Act, unless I'm just buying into the PR on that. But it seems to me that they are doing what Alex is talking about.
Right. Yeah. They're working at conflicting goals. And I think Alec was really alluding to it well, that, we want to create this transition in our economy to something that is much more sustainable. The challenge is that takes a lot of capital and it takes a lot of effort, right? It takes a lot of labor, a lot of money, a lot of resources to, redesign and re-envision the power grid. How we use water, how we use electricity, how we use other carbon fuels, right? Carbon-based fuels, the oil and gas, that is under the ground. Now, those things will take a lot of money. And to some degree, those will stimulate, some of the inflation that we have seen of recent. But here's the thing, right? So the more of that you spend on it, that money really has to come from somewhere. And we cannot continue to just use deficit spending to build that, right? At the same time, the Fed is saying, look, if the Fed doesn't get interest rates under control, here's the thing that I don't think everyone's thinking about. Unless we get interest and inflation under control, right, the cost of borrowing continues to increase. And if you look at the average interest rate on Treasury debt, right, so public government debt right now, I mean, it's done a U-turn. I think it's almost double the rate it was back when the Federal Reserve started increasing rates, right? So to the degree that interest rate, average interest rate that the government is paying on debt has to continue to increase to get these things under control, the more quickly sort of the dominoes fall in this situation, because your interest expense continues to go up. That discretionary spending I was talking about, that's going to continue to fall, and then it's like, well, where are you going to get this money for this green energy transition? It's just not there anymore. At least not at least not through subsidies, right? So what would happen is, right, we're all going to have to pay more in taxes, which would certainly be a wealth transfer. I don't know exactly how that would change the growth of the country's economy, especially if you're taking, essentially $1 and putting them directly into, green infrastructure, things like that. I mean, that's going to have a knock-on effects that will be very good for overall economic growth. But at the same time, all of us are going to feel poor because our tax rates are going to go, much higher. So there's all sorts of things that are going to have to give to come up with that new equilibrium that I think Alec was alluding to. It's going to be quite the time, and so let's get practical, right? Let's talk about, what does this mean for our audience, right? What actionable things can they do for their companies to prepare for that day, right? Well, this is fairly straightforward. You need to be very careful about your account receivables, right? Who do you owe money to? Who owes you money, right? I was just talking to a business owner I've known for many years now. He runs a fantastic manufacturing firm, and he was talking about how his company has over the last many years done a lot with extending credit, right? Especially when supply chains, I think, were disrupted. A lot of firms said, look, you know what? Things are really messy right now. Just pay me when you can, or whatever. We're just going to make things work. I think some of that mindset needs to change very quickly here. We need to make sure that we understand, who owes us money and who we owe money to so that, when the subsidies, stop, or when, taxes have to be increased significantly, right? You don't want to be caught off guard by those kinds of things in your business, right? So we need to be thinking about, playing that game 2 and 3 steps ahead right now, because if you're not, I would be very concerned for you.
Okay, Alex, what do you have to add to that?
Well, it's a very complicated world that we're in, and it's going to be the only way to really avoid the fact that it's going to be very expensive. I think there's a difference between inflation and expensive. I mean, there may not be. I may just be saying that, but inflation is one thing, but everything is going to cost more because there's so many regulations and so on. And it's a matter of navigating through all those expenses. And if you think about some of the transitions that are required out there, well, one of the things that's really obvious is that you've got to have a better approvals process. Now, people have been talking about this for years and years, but if you're going to have this energy transition, which I personally think is the number one thing that's going to occupy governments in the public sector over the next 2 decades, then you've got to have the materials and the commodities and so on that go into these projects. And that means you can't be fooling around with taking 6 years to 8 years to approve a mining project. So government's going to have to really step up in that area. And then I know I keep dwelling on this, but I have never seen anything like the number of mega projects, construction projects that are out there, and it's in the area of battery plants and car plants and so on. And these things are, to a certain extent, on a wish and a prayer. And as I say, there's a caveat in that the general public has to want to buy these things. And then there's things like carbon capture and storage, and some of that's fine, but there's aspects of that, and there's monies being spent in some areas of that you really wonder about. There's something called direct air capture, and if you don't know what that is, look it up. And it's a fascinating idea, and it's a new idea. But who knows? I mean, this is experimental, and whether we can really move to hydrogen and so on. And then when I talk about mega projects, the one thing that I know about mega projects going way back is that they are notorious for not meeting their scheduled completion date and running way over budget.
Yep, can confirm.
Yeah. Well, in Canada, in particular, there have been mega projects that have been notorious, and it's not just Canada; it's all around the world. Where if there isn't tremendously detailed upfront planning for these projects, you get into trouble, and that's why I'm saying that adds to the whole issue of the world's just really going to be expensive. And then there's all the technology you have to buy to stay current with technology, and you have to buy to, we'll see what happens in terms of artificial intelligence. Maybe artificial intelligence will come along and teach everybody how to keep costs down. But at the moment, everything's expensive. Labor costs are going up. This stage in the cycle, the inflation component that's the most worrisome now is labor costs, because the supply shortages in terms of ports and so on, that's been taken care of. But anyway, so traditional answers to economic problems, there's going to have to be a whole lot more thinking outside the box.
Okay, well, I'm even more filled with existential dread, as is my wallet, than usual. So thanks again, guys, for joining us. And until next month, we'll talk again.
Very good. Thank you, Warren.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's it for this episode, but if you'd like to hear more of the Construction Record podcast, you can hear us on Apple Music, Amazon Music, and Spotify, as well as on the Journal of Commerce and Daily Commercial News websites. Thanks for listening.